The appointment was already made. 3 days before her birthday I walked into that bank knowing exactly what I was going to do. My name is Margaret Evans. I'm 68 years old. 32 years at the New York Public Library. A widow. A woman who raised her son alone and did everything right. Before I tell you what they did to me, please hit subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from today. If you give this a like, good luck is coming your way. They took $15,000 from my 401k. They forged my name on a $12,000 sofa receipt. And at a charity gala, I stood 4 feet behind a champagne tower and heard my daughter-in-law tell a roomful of strangers I had early onset dementia. She can't manage her own finances anymore. Her voice was warm, practiced. My son took my arm. Don't make a scene, Mom. You're confused again. I wasn't confused. I was being erased. In her handbag a power of attorney form. In my closet a shoebox they never knew existed. They had $63,000 of my retirement savings already spent. What they didn't have was the shoebox. And they had no idea what was inside it, or what I was about to do. The 401k statement arrived on a Tuesday, the way all bad news does, quietly, without warning. Tucked inside a plain white envelope between a coupon circular and a reminder about her dental cleaning. Margaret Evans set her reading glasses on the kitchen table, smoothed the paper flat with both palms, and began to read. The kitchen was the kind of room that had earned its stillness. 41 years of Sunday roasts and first day of school breakfasts and late-night cups of chamomile had settled into the walls. The copper pots her late husband Robert had bought at a flea market in Brooklyn hung above the stove exactly where he'd put them. The window above the sink still let in the same angle of October light. It always had, pale gold and slightly dusty, the kind of light that made everything look like a memory before it had finished happening. Margaret was 68 years old, and she had learned to love the quiet. After 32 years working the reference desk at the New York Public Library's Jefferson Market branch. After raising a son largely on her own once Robert's health began to fail, after the long, careful business of grief, she had settled into her Manhattan apartment like a woman who had earned every square foot of it. The rent was paid. The utility bills were manageable. She had her books, her Tuesday afternoon tea with her neighbor Ruth, and the certainty that she would never be a burden to anyone. That certainty was what made her stop on the second page. The line read simply withdrawal home improvement $15,000. She read it again, then again. Her lips moved slightly, the way they used to when she helped patrons decipher difficult text. As though the careful act of reading might change what the words said. She had not authorized a $15,000 withdrawal. She had not spoken to anyone at the bank in 3 months. She had not, to her knowledge, made any decisions about home improvement, not for this apartment, and certainly not for anywhere else. The bathroom faucet dripped occasionally. The radiator clanked in February. But $15,000? For what? The steam rising from her tea mug caught the October light and curled upward, slow and indifferent. Margaret set the statement down on top of the stack of old catalogs. She kept meaning to recycle and placed her palm flat over the page, as though she could press the number back into something that made sense. My memory, she thought, and the thought came with a cold. Little shame she recognized from doctor's appointments and the occasional lost word in the middle of a sentence. Is this what it's like? Is this how it starts? But then she sat very still, and she thought harder, and she could not locate in any corner of her mind a single conversation, a single signature. A single moment in which $15,000 had seemed like a reasonable expenditure on anything. She had repainted the hallway 2 years ago. That had cost $400 and a weekend of breathing turpentine fumes and listening to a Patsy Cline album. She folded the statement in half and tucked it beneath the catalogs. That Sunday, Daniel came for dinner, the way he had every first Sunday of the month since Robert died. He was 43 now, her son. She sometimes struggled to reconcile the man who walked through her door broad-shouldered, expensive. Carrying the particular confidence of someone who had learned to wear a good suit with the boy she still kept in her chest like a photograph. He had his father's jaw and her eyes, though lately her eyes in his face looked like they were looking past things rather than at them. Claire came with him, naturally. Claire always came. She was 38, Daniel's wife, and she was the kind of beautiful that required significant maintenance. which she documented in 30-second increments for approximately 500,000 people who followed her on a platform Margaret had never learned to fully understand. Manifesting Abundance was the name of the channel. Margaret had looked it up once on a quiet Thursday afternoon, and had watched 3 videos before closing the laptop and making herself a stronger cup of tea than usual. They came through the door at 6:15. Claire's coat was new cream-colored cashmere, the kind that picked up every stray fiber in a room and didn't care. She kissed Margaret's cheek and immediately set her handbag on the side table and pulled out her phone. "I have to post before 7, she said, not to anyone in particular. "The algorithm is impossible on Sundays if you miss the window." "Of course," Margaret said. Daniel hung his coat on the hook by the door, Robert's hook, still in Robert's spot, and followed his mother into the kitchen. He moved through the apartment with the comfortable ease of someone who had grown up in it. Touching the countertop, glancing at the copper pots, then looking immediately at his phone. He was wearing a watch she hadn't seen before. It sat on his left wrist with the specific weight of something that costs more than it should. "Is that new?" she asked. He glanced down as though noticing it for the first time. "Yeah, early birthday gift. From me to me." He smiled, but the smile didn't quite reach his eyes, and he was already looking back at his phone. They ate the pot roast she'd started at noon. The green beans were from the farmer's market on West 10th, still slightly crisp the way Robert had liked them. She had set the table with the good cloth napkins, the ones with the embroidered edges, because it was still Sunday dinner even if no one else seemed to notice. Claire appeared once the food was plated, leaving her phone face down beside her fork. A concession that Margaret had come to understand meant the filming portion of the evening was complete. "You should see what I did with the kitchen," Claire said, helping herself to the green beans without looking up. "The island finally came in. Absolute game changer." "Oh?" Margaret said. "Full Calacatta marble. The veining is insane." She picked up her phone to show Margaret a photograph. A gleaming expanse of white stone, caught in the kind of studio-quality light that Margaret was fairly certain did not occur naturally in a Brooklyn brownstone. 800,000 people are going to see this by midnight. I already have 6 brands asking about partnership. It's beautiful, Margaret said, because it was, and because she did not know what else to say. She glanced at Daniel. He was looking at the watch. Just for a moment, a small, involuntary check, like a man who knows the time but keeps looking anyway. He felt her gaze and met it, and something passed across his face so briefly she almost convinced herself she'd imagined it. Almost. She thought about the statement under the catalogs. She thought about the line that read "Home Improvement." She almost asked. The words formed in her throat, clear and specific. "Daniel, there's a withdrawal I don't remember making. Can you help me understand it?" But Claire was pulling up a second photograph, the kitchen from a different angle, the morning light hitting the marble just so, and Daniel was nodding along, his jaw set in the careful way of a man performing attentiveness, and Margaret swallowed the question with a sip of water. Later, she told herself. "You'll ask him privately. Don't make something out of nothing." Dinner ended at 8. Claire gathered her coat and her bag and her phone and was through the door first, already typing. Daniel paused at the threshold, hands in his pockets, and for just a moment he looked at his mother. The way he used to look at her when he was small and had done something he wasn't sure she'd forgiven, a look that was half apology and half appeal, asking her not to ask. "Good dinner, Mom," he said. "Same time next month," she said. The door closed. The kitchen settled back into its silence. Margaret cleared the plates, filled the sink, and stood for a long time at the window above it, looking out at the amber grid of Manhattan at night. Somewhere across the park, in a brownstone with a Calacatta marble island, 500,000 strangers were double-tapping a photograph of her son's debt. She dried her hands. She went to the counter. She lifted the stack of catalogs and looked at the folded statement underneath. The numbers on the page don't lie, she thought. Even if everything else does. She left it there and went to bed, but she did not sleep easily, and for the first time in a long time, she left the hallway light on. The notification arrived on a Wednesday morning, while Margaret was still in her robe. She had been sitting at the kitchen table with her second cup of coffee and the crossword puzzle from Tuesday's paper. She always did them a day late. A habit she'd developed during the years when Robert was sick and mornings required a slower kind of attention. The October light was doing its usual work through the window, catching the rim of her coffee mug and throwing a small crescent of gold onto the tablecloth. Her phone buzzed against the wood. She picked it up without urgency, expecting Ruth, or possibly a reminder about her eye appointment. The notification was from Chase. Her sapphire card had been used at a store called Meridian Home and Design on West 23rd Street. Current balance $14,847. Available credit $0. Margaret set the coffee mug down. She had not been to West 23rd Street in at least 6 weeks. She had not been to any furniture store in longer than that, not since she and Robert had replaced the living room sofa the year before he was diagnosed, a beige sectional that she still thought of as new even though it was going on 11 years old now. She used the sapphire card for groceries, for her pharmacy, for the occasional dinner out with Ruth. She kept the limit deliberately low. $3,000. Enough for emergencies, not enough for trouble. Except the limit showing on her screen was not $3,000. She put on her reading glasses and looked again. The limit was $15,000. The limit had apparently been $15,000 for some time. Based on the billing history that loaded when she pressed through to the account, a history that included charges at restaurants she had never visited, a spa in Tribeca, a subscription to something called a content creation suite, and, 3 weeks ago, a furniture purchase at Meridian Home and Design for $12,214. Her hands were very steady as she set the phone on the table. This was something she had noticed about herself in the years since Robert died, that her hands stayed steady precisely when the rest of her wanted to come apart. It was the librarian in her, she supposed. The habit of composure in the presence of difficult information. She thought about the marble kitchen island. She thought about Claire's voice saying the veining is insane. She thought about the way Daniel had looked at his watch. She called his office at 9:15. The office of Evans Architecture was in a converted loft in Dumbo, Brooklyn, a space Daniel had photographed for his website with the specific pride of a man who understood that environments communicate ambition. Margaret had visited twice, once when he first moved in and once to drop off a birthday card when he'd been too busy to come to the phone. Both times she had felt the slightly unreal quality of the space. The exposed brick and the drafting tables and the young associates who spoke in the shorthand of people who had recently been in graduate school. His assistant, a young woman named Priya, told her Daniel was in a client meeting and could she take a message. "Please tell him his mother called," Margaret said. "It's regarding a financial matter that requires his attention today." She enunciated financial matter with the particular clarity of a woman who had spent 32 years explaining the Dewey Decimal System to people who were fairly certain it didn't apply to them. Daniel called back at 11:40. "Mom, hey, Priya said it was urgent? I received a notification this morning," Margaret said, "about the Chase Sapphire card. I need you to help me understand some of the charges." A pause. Brief but specific. "What kind of charges?" "A furniture purchase, primarily. $12,000 at a place called Meridian. And the credit limit, Daniel, the limit on that card is $15,000. I opened that account with a $3,000 limit." "Mom." His voice shifted into the register she recognized, careful, slightly slowed, the tone one uses with someone who is not quite keeping up. "We talked about this, remember? Back in the spring, when the rate on your savings account dropped, you said you wanted to adjust the card limit so you had more flexibility." "I have no memory of that conversation. You were having a hard week. You were tired." A breath. "Mom, look, I know these things can be confusing." "Daniel." She kept her voice even. "I want to see the authorization form. If I signed something changing that limit, I want to see my signature." Another pause. Longer this time. "I'll look into it," he said. "I'm sure it's just a processing mix-up. These things happen with linked accounts. We don't have linked accounts." "Mom." The careful voice again, with just a trace of something underneath it, not quite impatience, but the precursor to it, the breath before the door closes. "Let me look into it. I'll call you this week." He did not call that week. Margaret found the receipt on a Thursday afternoon, 3 days after the phone call. She had gone to take the recycling down to the bins in the building's basement, a task she'd been putting off, and had tied the bundle of catalogs with the kitchen twine she kept in the second drawer. It was in the act of clearing the counter space that she moved the paper bag by the trash. Can, the one Daniel had left during his last visit when he'd helped himself to a glass of water and lingered by the counter, fiddling with his phone. The receipt had been tucked under the bag, or possibly inside. It, crumpled in the particular way of something that had been balled up in a pocket and then reconsidered. She smoothed it flat on the counter. Meridian Home and Design, October 3rd, 1-1 Palermo Sectional Sofa, Ivory Boucle $12,214. Authorized signature line at the bottom M. Evans. She looked at the signature for a long time. She had taught handwriting in the way that all serious readers eventually teach themselves, by paying attention to how other people formed their letters, by noticing the particular idiosyncrasies. That made a signature rather than just a name. Her own M was distinctive. A broad first hump, a narrower second, the crossbar of the E running just slightly long on the right side. A habit from decades of initialing library acquisition forms. The M on the Meridian receipt had 2 equal humps. The E's crossbar was centered. It was close. It was meant to be close. But it was not her signature. She stood at the kitchen counter for a long time, holding the receipt, listening to the radiator knock and the distant sound of a siren moving up 6th Avenue. Then she went to her bedroom, took the shoebox down from the top shelf of the closet, the one where she kept important papers. A habit from a generation that didn't entirely trust filing cabinets, and slid the receipt inside, next to the 401k statement she'd placed there 3 days ago. I'm not confused, she thought. I am being told that I am confused. Those are not the same thing. She tried once more to reach him directly, that Friday evening, calling his cell rather than the office. He answered on the 4th ring, and she could hear, behind his voice, the ambient sound of a restaurant, the clink of glassware, the low current of conversation. The particular acoustic warmth of a room that costs money to sit in. Daniel, I have a question about the mortgage on the brownstone. I'd like to understand the current status. A brief sound, not quite a laugh, not quite a sigh. Mom, can we do this another time? I'm at dinner. Of course. When would be better? I'll call you Sunday. Is everything manageable? With the mortgage and the... Everything's fine. The careful voice was gone. What was left was tired and thin, and she heard in it something she recognized from the years when he was a teenager and money was short and he came home from school already knowing before she said anything that the answer was no. Except now the tiredness was aimed at her. Mom, everything is fine. I'll call Sunday. The line went quiet. Margaret set the phone on the kitchen table and reached into her cardigan pocket, a reflex, the way she always did when she was standing still and thinking. Her fingers found her Medicare card, the hard plastic edge of it, and she held it between her thumb and forefinger without taking it out. She had paid into Medicare for decades. She had the card because she had earned the card, because she had worked and contributed and planned the way Robert always said. To plan quietly, consistently, without expecting applause. The apartment was paid for. The retirement account was funded. The safety net was supposed to hold. If I lose this, she thought, and she did not finish the sentence out loud, only let it sit in the kitchen with her, in the October quiet. If I lose this house, I lose the only thing your father left for me. And I lose it to a marble kitchen island. She stayed at the table until the light outside the window had gone entirely dark. Then she got up, refilled the kettle, and began making a list. The invitation arrived by text, Claire's preferred medium for communication that required a veneer of warmth. Margaret, the Hargrove Foundation Gala is this Saturday. Daniel and I would love for you to join us. It's a wonderful cause and we think it would be good for you to get out a bit. Dress code is cocktail. We'll pick you up at 7. Margaret read it twice, sitting at the reference desk of her own life. Which is to say, at the kitchen table, with a cup of tea and the careful habit of considering all available information before drawing a conclusion. She did not particularly want to go. She had been to 2 Hargrove Foundation galas during Robert's lifetime and had found them to be the particular kind of charity event where the cost of the ticket exceeded the amount raised for the charity itself, and where the food was beautiful and insufficient. But she wanted to see Daniel in a context where Claire could not so easily steer the conversation. She wanted to watch his face in a room full of people, away from the careful management of monthly dinners and brief phone calls. She replied, "Thank you, Claire. I'll be ready at 7. The gala was held at a hotel on the Upper East Side. whose ballroom had been festooned with white orchids and the kind of tasteful ambient lighting that made everyone look slightly more significant than they were. A string quartet played near the entrance. Champagne arrived on trays carried by young people in black. The cause, as far as Margaret could determine from the program she was handed, involved the restoration of historic urban green spaces, which she found genuinely admirable even if the marble and gold surroundings felt like an ironic setting for it. Daniel wore a dark suit that fit him the way expensive suits fit men who have recently lost weight without meaning to the shoulders correct, the jacket slightly loose through the chest. He moved through the room with the practiced ease of someone who had attended many such events, shaking hands, making brief, competent conversation, steering them from cluster to cluster with the light pressure of a hand at the small of the back. Claire wore a dress the color of winter sky and carried herself the way she always did in public, a particular radiance, a curated warmth, the performance of a person who understood that being watched was its own form of currency. She was, Margaret admitted to herself, extraordinarily good at it. She moved through groups of women with the smooth efficiency of someone who catalogued faces for future use, deploying laughter at precise moments, touching elbows, leaning in for the kind of intimate exchanges that made the other person feel specially chosen. Margaret accepted a glass of champagne and stood near one of the tall windows overlooking Fifth Avenue, watching. She was watching Daniel, specifically. The way he checked his phone twice in the first 20 minutes. The way he smiled at something a man in a gray suit said to him, and then immediately, behind the smile, something that was not quite worry, something quieter and more chronic than worry, like a man with a low-grade fever he has learned to ignore. She was thinking about the list she'd made at the kitchen table. The withdrawal, the receipt, the forged signature, the card with the inflated limit. She found a moment, just before the dinner was seated, to step away from the group. Daniel had been steering them toward and stand beside the champagne tower near the north wall, where the noise of the room created a useful privacy. She was reading the program again more closely this time, noting the foundation's board members when she heard Claire's voice from just around the other side of the tower. Honestly, it's getting more pronounced. Last week she called me 3 times in one morning and then couldn't remember she'd called at all. Margaret went very still. That's worrying. A woman's voice. Someone Margaret didn't know. It is. We're trying to be sensitive about it because she's fiercely independent, you know, the type old school, doesn't want to be seen as losing it. Claire's voice was measured, genuinely concerned sounding. Warm with the specific warmth of a woman who had learned to deploy empathy strategically. The doctors are using the phrase early onset, but honestly I think it's been progressing for a year at least. Daniel's beside himself. Is she still living alone? For now. We're starting to have the conversation about what comes next. It's just you want to respect someone's dignity, you know? But at a certain point, safety has to come first. And the financial management is becoming a concern. A murmur of sympathy from the other woman. The sound of glasses touching. Margaret's face was warm. She knew the exact quality of warmth she had felt it before, this particular heat. This sudden vascular event that preceded the moment when you understand that something you suspected is actually true. She had felt it the first time a patron at the library had spoken over her to a younger colleague. She had felt it at the hospital when a resident had addressed Robert's diagnosis to the wall behind her rather than to her face. She knew the temperature of being erased. She stepped around the tower. Claire saw her immediately. Not a flicker of recognition that she'd been overheard. Only the smooth, split-second recalibration of a woman who had been performing in front of cameras long enough to never be caught unready. Her expression softened into something that looked, if you didn't know better, like loving concern. Margaret, I was just telling Sandra about you. Are you feeling all right? You look a little pale. The woman named Sandra was looking at Margaret with the careful, slightly tilted head expression of someone who has just been told to expect symptoms. I'm quite well, Margaret said. Her voice came out steady. She was glad for that. Come sit with us, Claire said, already moving, already reaching for Margaret's arm with the practiced ease of someone guiding a person who needs guiding. Margaret stepped back just slightly, just enough. I'll find Daniel, she said. She turned and walked back into the room, and the heat in her face did not leave her. But something below it was cooling rapidly into something harder and more useful. She found Daniel at the bar, his back to the room, swirling a whiskey glass in a slow circle. "Daniel," she said quietly. He turned, and when he saw her face, something moved behind his eyes, not guilt. Exactly, but the shadow of a man who has heard a door close somewhere in the house and cannot quite remember if he locked it. "Mom, hey, dinner's about to start. I need you to listen to me." She kept her voice low. The room buzzed pleasantly around them. "I am not confused. I am not forgetting things. Whatever you and Claire are telling people, I need you to understand that I am fully aware of what is happening." He opened his mouth. "Don't." She looked at him directly, and for a moment she let him see exactly how much she knew, or suspected, or was in the process of confirming. "Not here, I know." A long moment. She watched him search for the careful voice and find it. "Mom, I think you misheard something. Claire is just worried about you. We're all worried. I know what I heard, Daniel." He touched her arm then, gently, and that was the worst of it, that it was still a gentle touch, that she could feel her son in the gesture. Even as she understood that the gesture was a strategy. "Come sit down," he said quietly. "Don't make a scene. You're confused again." The word again landed like a thumb pressed on a bruise. She let him guide her to the table. She sat through the dinner. She ate the beautiful, insufficient food and listened to the speeches about urban green spaces and made the correct responses when spoken to. She was a librarian. She had spent 3 decades being professionally invisible, moving through rooms as a facilitator of other people's needs, a keeper of quiet order. She was also a woman who had just watched her daughter-in-law's handbag swing open when Claire reached into it for her lipstick after the salad course. And she had seen, clearly and unmistakably, the edge of a legal-sized envelope inside. The kind of envelope that holds forms that require signatures, the kind of forms that transfer authority from one person to another. She picked up her champagne glass and took a slow sip. They aren't just taking the money, she thought, watching Claire laugh beautifully at something the man beside her had said. They are erasing me, turning off my mind like a light switch so they can be the ones who hold the lamp. She set the glass down and folded her hands in her lap and smiled at the person across from her, because she was 68 years old. And she had been in enough difficult rooms to know the value of not showing your cards before you've finished counting them. But she counted them carefully, all through the dinner and the ride home. Sitting in the back of the car while Claire posted to her stories and Daniel drove and the city moved past the windows in its amber and neon grid. She counted every single one. She did not call Ruth the next morning. She didn't call anyone. She sat at the kitchen table as she had been sitting at it for most of the week, in the same chair. With the same view of the copper pots and the window and the October light that had moved, over the past few weeks, from gold into something thinner and less forgiving. November was close. She could feel it in the radiator's early morning groaning, in the way the park trees had gone from rust to bare, in the particular quality of the cold that now pressed against the window glass and made the apartment feel smaller than it was. On the table in front of her was everything. Not everything, literally. She had been careful about that, keeping the most important documents in the shoebox in the closet. But the surface version of everything, the pieces she'd allowed herself to take out and look at directly, 3 overdue notices. 2 of them for credit accounts she had no memory of opening, and 1 from a financial services company offering a home equity line she had apparently applied for in September. There was a letter from a law firm she did not recognize, addressed to her, referring to the account restructuring recently authorized. There was a printout she had made at the library's computer station she had not wanted to search from her own laptop. Some instinct she couldn't name showing the property records for her apartment building. The ownership entry for her unit had an annotation she had never seen before, added 4 months ago pending estate planning review. She looked at these pieces for a long time without touching them. The apartment was so quiet she could hear the building's elevator moving 2 floors below her, the soft mechanical sigh of it, the distant click of the doors. Somewhere on the street, a car alarm went through its full cycle and stopped. A pigeon landed on the windowsill, regarded her with the specific indifference of urban wildlife, and departed. Margaret reached across the table and picked up the framed photograph she had brought in from the hallway that morning. She had done it without quite deciding to, had simply found herself, at 6 a.m., standing in the hallway in her robe, unhooking the frame from the nail where it had hung since Robert put it up, sometime in the mid-90s. It was Daniel at 11. A summer afternoon, the garage, Robert's workbench along the back wall. With its careful rows of labeled coffee cans, screws in one, nails in another, washers sorted by size. Daniel was standing at the workbench with a hammer in his right hand and a look of absolute concentration on his face. He was making a birdhouse, the third one that summer, Robert had said. He was getting serious about the joinery. He wanted the entrance hole to be exactly the right diameter for the species he was hoping to attract. Robert's hand rested on the boy's shoulder. Both of them were looking at the wood. Margaret looked at the photograph for a long time. The boy in the photograph had not known yet that wanting things cost something. He had only known the pleasure of making something true, of fitting one piece to another until the whole was stronger than the parts. He had his father's patience then. His father's hands. She set the photograph face down on the table. Where did you go? She thought, though she wasn't sure anymore whether she was asking Daniel or asking herself or asking the version of the future. She had believed in the one where doing everything right meant that in the end, you were safe. I raised you. I sat with your father through the nights he couldn't breathe without flinching. I kept this apartment and the accounts and the careful plan of it all, so that you would have something and I would not be a weight around anyone's neck. And you looked at what I built and you saw a resource. You saw a withdrawal schedule. She pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes. Briefly, the way she used to when she was very tired and had one more shelf to catalog before she could go home. Am I just a burden to be liquidated? The question surfaced without her entirely meaning it to, rising from somewhere below the careful composure she'd been maintaining since the gala, since the champagne tower, since the word dementia in Claire's voice, warm, concerned, utterly deliberate. The question sat in the empty kitchen and the kitchen had no answer for it. She lowered her hands. The pill organizer was on the counter, where she kept it, the kind with the snap-open compartments for each day of the week. She took a mild blood pressure medication, a calcium supplement, and a low-dose aspirin. She had been taking them so long they were simply part of the texture of mornings, like coffee and the crossword. She looked at it now from across the kitchen with the strange, slightly distant feeling that had been following her for days. The feeling of looking at the objects of your life from a perspective that has shifted without warning. Like a painting that reveals a different composition depending on where in the room you're standing. She got up and refilled the kettle. She stood at the stove waiting for the water to boil, her hand resting on the cool iron surface of the stove. And she looked at the copper pots and thought about Robert buying them at the flea market on a Saturday in June. She remembered the heat of that day. The smell of old metal and sawdust, Robert's absolute certainty that these were the correct pots and that the asking price was not. He had bargained for them in his careful, good-humored way. And the seller had come down $12, and Robert had carried them home on the subway like trophies. He had been so sure about things. Which things to fight for and which to let go. How to hold both at once. The kettle began to murmur. Tomorrow, the bank owns the house, she thought, not literally, not yet, but the logic of it was there. The arithmetic of debt and disappeared savings and documents she had not signed adding up toward an outcome that she could see the shape of even if she couldn't yet see the end of it. And I own nothing but my shame. She poured the water over the tea bag and carried the mug back to the table and sat down again, in the chair that had been hers for 41 years, in the kitchen that had held every important thing. She looked at the overdue notices. She looked at the photograph lying face down. She looked at the copper pots above the stove, catching the thin November light and holding it. She reached out and turned the photograph back over. The boy with the hammer. The careful hands. The father's steady weight on the shoulder. She looked at it for a long moment, and somewhere in the looking, something shifted. Not resolve yet. Resolve would come later, built from smaller materials. But the first material, the first useful thing, the recognition that the grief she was feeling was not for herself. But for him, for what he had allowed himself to become, for what had been crowded out of him, and that grief, properly understood, was not a reason to be still. She picked up her tea. She began to think, well, friends, we've come to the halfway point of Margaret's story. And I have to say, I hope you've been holding your teacup a little tighter than usual, because this one has been something. We watched a woman who did everything right, who saved carefully, who loved unconditionally, who kept the faith in her family long past the moment most people would have walked away. Discover that the people closest to her had been slowly, methodically taking everything she'd built. The retirement account, the credit card, her own signature, forged on receipts while she was still in the next room. And perhaps most painfully of all, her reputation, her mind, her sense of her own reality. That moment at the gala, hearing Claire describe her as confused, as fading, as a woman who can no longer be trusted to manage her own life. That was the kind of cruelty that leaves a mark. Not because it was loud, but because it was quiet, and surgical, and wrapped in the language of concern. But here's what I noticed Margaret kept thinking. She kept counting. She kept the documents. She did not fall apart, even when everything around her was designed to make her feel like falling apart was the only option left. What's coming in the second half of this story? I'll just say this: Margaret Evans spent 32 years being the person who helped other people find what they were looking for. She knows how to do research. And she is not done yet. Stay with us, friends. She found the journal in the closet, behind the shoebox, on a Saturday morning. It was not her journal, she had never kept one. It was Robert's, a narrow green notebook he'd used during the 2 years of his illness when speaking had become unreliable, and writing was how he'd kept himself present in his own life. She had known it was there. She had simply not been ready to open it. She opened it now, sitting on the edge of the bed, the November light flat and colorless through the curtains. His handwriting was large in the later entries, the letters finding their own path across the unlined pages. She did not read it sequentially. She let it fall open and read what was there. "D needs to be the one who builds," one entry said. "Not the one who is built for. The difference will matter. Make sure he knows it." She sat with that for a long time. She thought about the garage, the birdhouses, the summer Daniel had spent learning to read blueprints because he wanted to understand, not just to use. There had been a boy there who understood the difference between making something and consuming something, who found the making more satisfying. Who came in at dinner time with sawdust in his hair and a kind of quiet pride she recognized as his father's. And then Claire. Or not Claire exactly, the wanting that Claire had learned to point in a direction. The Instagram grid, the marble island, the watch. The wanting had always been there, dormant, waiting for someone to hand it a vocabulary. I handed him the first credit card, Margaret thought. For college books. He was 19, and I handed it to him like a tool, and he used it like one, and then he learned to use it like something else entirely. And I let it happen because it was easier than the conversation. She closed the journal carefully and held it in her lap for a moment. This was not guilt, or not only guilt. It was something more like the specific clarity that comes when a pattern finally resolves. When you see the whole shape of something that has been growing for years in the periphery. She had made mistakes. Real ones. Small ones that had compounded. She could see that now, and seeing it did not undo what Daniel and Claire had done. But it gave her back her own agency in the story, made her a participant rather than simply a victim. She placed the journal back in the closet. She left the shoebox where it was. Then she sat at the kitchen table and wrote, in her careful librarian's hand, a list of every institution she would need to contact, every document she would need to produce, every step in the sequence of what would have to happen next. The handwriting on the list looked nothing like the M. Evans on the Meridian receipt. Her E's crossbar ran long on the right. I didn't give him wings, she thought, uncapping the pen again. I gave him a golden cage he couldn't afford. But the key to that cage has always been mine. And I am taking it back. She wrote the name of her bank at the top of the list. She underlined it twice. She made the appointment on a Monday and kept it on a Thursday, 3 days before Claire's 40th birthday party. Margaret dressed carefully that morning, not the way she dressed for Sunday dinners, which was comfortable and familiar, but the way she used to dress for library board meetings. The navy wool blazer she'd had for 12 years, the gray slacks pressed the night before, the small pearl earrings Robert had given her for their 20th anniversary. It was, she understood, a kind of armor, not because she needed to look impressive to herself, but because there is a particular quality of attention that a well-dressed 68-year-old woman receives in a bank, and she intended to use every advantage available to her. She walked the 11 blocks to the branch rather than taking a cab. The November air was sharp and clarifying, and she wanted to arrive having already committed to this with her body, not just her mind. The branch manager's name was a Mr. Aldridge, he was perhaps 50, with the carefully maintained demeanor of a man in a role that requires him to treat every customer as though their problem is both urgent and solvable. Margaret appreciated the professionalism. She had no interest in being treated with excessive warmth. She sat across from his desk and opened her folder on her lap and began. She had organized the documents in the order in which she intended to present them: the 401k statement first, then the Chase card history, then the Meridian receipt with the forged signature, and finally the overdue notices for accounts she had not opened. She presented each one calmly, with the measured clarity of a woman who has spent a professional lifetime making complex information accessible to people who are encountering it for the first time. Mr. Aldridge's expression shifted as she spoke, not dramatically, but in the careful, incremental way of a professional person processing information that is worse than he'd anticipated. "The signature on this receipt," he said, when she reached the Meridian document. "You're saying this is not your signature?" "I'm telling you it is a forgery," she said. "I can provide handwriting samples going back 30 years if necessary. I can provide notarized signatures from that same period. The comparison is not complicated." He looked at the receipt for a moment. "Mrs. Evans, have you spoken with your son about this?" "My son told me I had probably forgotten signing the authorization form." She kept her voice level. "I have not forgotten. I was not asked. These transactions were made without my knowledge or consent, some using forged documentation." She watched him absorb this. "I'd like to close the joint accounts," she continued. "I'd like to transfer the remaining funds in my savings account, approximately $63,000, into a private trust structure that requires my sole authorization for any transactions. I'd also like to flag the Chase Sapphire account for identity theft and begin the process of disputing the charges made without my knowledge." He was writing now. She appreciated that. There is something clarifying about being believed. "Additionally," she said, "I'd like to place an alert on the property records associated with this address. I have reason to believe that documentation may have been filed on my behalf without my consent." He looked up. "I'll need to involve our fraud department for some of this." "Of course," she said. "I have time." She met with the attorney the following day. His name was Marcus Webb. She had found him through Ruth, whose nephew had used him in a property dispute 2 years ago and described him as the kind of lawyer who was quiet right up until he wasn't. His office was on the 5th floor of a building on Lexington Avenue. Small and organized in the way of offices belonging to people who actually read everything they file. He had good light and a genuine ficus plant in the corner, which Margaret took as a positive indicator. She laid the same documents on his desk. She added 2 things she hadn't shown Mr. Aldridge: the recording she had made at the gala, a 40-second clip on her phone in which Claire's voice, warm, articulate, medically specific, described the progression of Margaret's dementia to a woman named Sandra, while Margaret stood on the other side of a champagne tower, and a screenshot she had taken at the library computer of the property record annotation. "Pending estate planning review." Marcus Webb listened. He looked at each document in the order she presented it. When he reached the recording, he listened to it twice. "Mrs. Evans," he said, when she had finished. "This is significantly more organized than most of what I receive." "I was a librarian," she said. Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile, but the precursor to one. "The power of attorney form your daughter-in-law may have in her possession if it was prepared without your knowledge. And on the basis of a fabricated medical history, it's not legally valid. The question is whether it's been filed anywhere." "I would like to ensure that it isn't," Margaret said. "And I'd like to know what options I have if it has been." "We have options," he said, and opened a notepad. She walked home along 5th Avenue, the park to her left, the afternoon light angled low and cold across the bare trees. She could feel the new quality of her spine, not stiffness, not tension, but the particular posture of a woman who has stopped waiting to be believed and has simply begun acting on what she knows. She passed a hardware store. She passed a flower seller wrapping white chrysanthemums in brown paper. She passed a young man on a bicycle weaving through the crosswalk with the joyful recklessness of someone who has not yet had a reason to be careful. She had been careful her entire life. Careful with money, with words, with feelings, with the space she occupied in rooms that were not designed with her in mind. She had been careful in the particular way of women who were taught that care was the price of dignity. It had cost her $63,000, a forged signature, and a public declaration of her mental incompetence at a charity gala. She was done being that kind of careful. At the corner of 72nd Street she stopped and looked at her phone. In 3 days, Claire's 40th birthday party would be broadcast live to 500,000 people. There would be white roses, she imagined, and filtered light, and the particular performance of abundance that was Claire's highest art form. There would, according to the event invitation she'd received and declined, be a surprise that Daniel had been planning for months. She knew what the surprise was. She had seen it in the Chase card's transaction history: a deposit to a luxury automotive dealership, a pending line of credit. The specific architecture of a man spending money he does not have on a gesture he cannot afford. She put her phone back in her pocket. I am not just protecting my money, she thought, turning the corner toward home. I am saving my son's soul by burning his house down. Because the house he built with Claire is made of the wrong materials. And it was always going to fall. She walked the rest of the way home without hurrying, and when she arrived, she made herself a cup of tea, sat at the kitchen table, and waited, with the particular patience of a woman who has already done everything that needs to be done. The birthday party began at 6 o'clock on a Saturday evening, and it was, by any measurable standard, a spectacle. Claire had rented a space in Dumbo, a converted warehouse with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the East River and the Brooklyn Bridge lit against the November dark. The aesthetic was deliberate: white roses everywhere, in arrangements that cost more individually than most people's weekly groceries, hanging Edison bulbs that cast the particular amber warmth. Her phone camera loved a grazing table along one wall, stacked with cheeses and charcuterie and small elegant things on crackers that required no actual eating, only photographing. A professional camera crew moved through the space at angles, capturing B-roll for what Claire had described in her pre-party post as a very special episode. She had told her audience to tune in at 8 o'clock for the surprise. Margaret learned all of this from Ruth, who followed Claire's channel with the specific and guiltless enthusiasm of someone who treats other people's curated lives as entertainment rather than instruction. Ruth had texted a screenshot of the pre-party post at 5:30 with the message, "She's doing a live for 500K people. Should I be watching this?" Margaret had texted back, "Yes. Keep me informed." Then she had poured herself a glass of white wine, the Sauvignon Blanc she kept for the occasions that required something better than tea, and settled into the armchair by the window with her tablet propped on the side table, found Claire's channel, and pressed play on the live stream. The space on her screen was beautiful, she would give Claire that. The camera work was professional. The audio was clean. Claire moved through her own party with the trained ease of someone for whom a camera is simply another dimension of presence turning toward it. Naturally, incorporating the lens into her conversation, never appearing to perform even as performance was precisely what she was doing. The comments scrolled in a waterfall down the right side of the screen. Margaret watched them with the dispassionate attention of a woman reading a reference catalog. "You look amazing, Claire. Where's the dress from? This is everything. Goals. Can't wait for the surprise." Daniel appeared briefly at 9 minutes in, standing near the grazing table with a glass of something amber, talking to a man Margaret didn't recognize. He looked, she thought, the way he'd looked at the Sunday dinner table for the past year, present and slightly absent simultaneously. A man maintaining his position in a room while his attention was somewhere below the surface. She wondered if he had checked the Chase account yet. She wondered what he thought when he did. At 8:14, Claire positioned herself in front of the window overlooking the bridge. The camera crew arrayed at a respectful distance, and addressed her audience directly. "Okay, you guys," she said, and her voice had the particular pitch of performed breathlessness. "You have been asking me for weeks what's happening tonight, and I have been so good at keeping this secret." A laugh. Comments cascading. "Tell us. We're dying. My absolute rock. My partner in everything. The man who makes this whole life possible." She turned, and the camera pulled back to include Daniel, who was walking toward her from across the room carrying a small, gift-wrapped box, and behind him, visible through the open warehouse doors, the specific silhouette of an automobile draped in a white silk cloth. The room responded. Margaret heard the sound on her tablet speaker, 50 people gasping and applauding in a brick-walled space with good acoustics. A sound that traveled across Brooklyn and arrived in her living room on the Upper West Side like the echo of something that was about to go wrong. Daniel handed Claire the small box first. She opened it on camera. Something with the distinctive teal of a particular jewelry brand, and the comments exploded. Then the warehouse doors opened wider, and a man in a dealership blazer stepped forward and took hold of the silk cloth. "Happy 40th, Daniel said, and there was a waver in his voice that the audience probably read as emotion and that Margaret read as something else entirely. The cloth fell. A silver Audi Q7 sat in the doorway, catching the Edison lights, looking exactly like the kind of car that signals arrival. Claire screamed. She pressed her hands to her face. She turned to Daniel and threw her arms around him, and the camera caught it beautifully, the hug against the amber light with the car gleaming behind them. Margaret watched. Then the dealership representative stepped forward with the paperwork and the card reader, and Daniel stepped back from Claire's embrace, and Margaret watched her son reach into his jacket pocket and produce a card, and she watched him hold it to the reader. With the absolute steadiness of a man who has been pretending everything is fine for so long that the pretense has become a form of muscle memory. The reader beeped. The representative looked at the screen. He looked at Daniel. "I'm sorry, sir. This card is I'm getting a decline." The room went very quiet. Not silent, the comments were still cascading, though their tone had shifted with the speed that an audience shifts when it senses something real. But the in-room sound dropped out of its ambient warmth and into something thinner and more electric. Daniel's face did not change. This was the thing that stayed with Margaret later, that his face did not change in the way of a man encountering a surprise, but in the way of a man who has been bracing for something and has finally felt the impact. "Try this one," he said, and produced a second card. The second card declined. The representative looked at him again with the expression of a man whose training covers many scenarios and who is now in one of them. His voice was professionally level and carried clearly in the newly quiet room and through the live stream's audio to 500,000 viewers in various time zones. "Sir, this account appears to have been flagged. There's a notation here: fraud alert, account frozen." The comments were moving very fast now. Too fast to read individually. Margaret could see the shape of them changing, the confusion, the shock, the specific excitement of people watching something real happen to a performance. Claire had lowered her hands from her face. "What?" Her voice had lost its calibrated warmth. Just for a moment, just the single syllable, it was something rawer and sharper. The sound of a woman who has built her security on a particular arrangement and is feeling that arrangement give way beneath her. "Daniel." Her eyes went to him. Not the camera, not the audience, to him, directly, and there was no warmth in it. "What did you do?" It was not a question. He didn't answer immediately. He stood in the amber light, in the expensive suit, in front of the car he couldn't afford, and he looked the way Margaret had been trying to remember him looking for a very long time. Not the managed competence, not the careful performance, but something underneath all of it, honest and devastated and very young. "I don't know," he said, and his voice cracked in the middle of it, and the camera caught that too. The comments were a wall of text now. The representative was speaking into his earpiece. Someone from the catering staff had appeared near the door, uncertain. The professional camera crew had the terrible competence of their profession and kept filming. Claire walked out of the frame. She didn't stomp, didn't make the dramatic exit that the situation might seem to call for. She simply stepped to the left, out of the camera's angle. And the composure was in the stepping, the reflex of a person who has spent years controlling what the lens sees. What the camera caught, in the moment of stepping away, was her face in transition, the wellness persona dissolving into something else. Something jagged at the edges, something that was not for the audience. 500,000 people saw it. Margaret put the tablet down on the side table. She sat for a moment in the quiet of the apartment, in the chair by the window. With the half glass of Sauvignon Blanc and the copper pots gleaming in the kitchen and the city doing its city business beyond the glass. She was not, she noticed, happy. She had thought she might feel something like satisfaction, the specific, clean feeling of something put right. But what she felt was more complicated than that, because the man standing in the amber light looking cracked open had her eyes, and somewhere inside the man with the declined cards was still the boy with the birdhouse, and watching one disintegrate did not make the other less real. She felt relief. She felt grief. She felt the particular mixture of the two that she suspected was simply the feeling of loving someone truthfully. She picked up her phone and looked at the screen for a moment. Then she set it back down without dialing. She would call him tomorrow. Or she would wait until he called her. Either way, there would be a conversation, and it would be a hard one, and it would be the first honest conversation they had managed in probably 3 years. She got up. She put the wine glass in the sink. She stood at the window and looked at the park, the bare trees, the amber smear of the streetlights on the wet November pavement. Today, she thought, the bank wrote in ink what my heart had been shouting in silence. That's enough for tonight. She turned off the kitchen light and went to bed, and for the first time in weeks, she slept without leaving the hallway light on. A year is a long time, and it isn't. It's long enough for a woman to repaint her hallway again, this time a soft sage green, because she had earned the right to do something new with a wall. Long enough for the shoebox of documents to move from the closet shelf to Marcus Webb's office filing system, where it became exhibits in a civil case that settled quietly and in Margaret's favor 9 months after the gala. Long enough for Claire's channel to pivot from manifesting abundance to my authentic rebuilding journey, which garnered significantly fewer followers and a great deal of pointed commentary in the replies. And it was long enough for Daniel Evans to drive a rusted 2012 pickup truck to Montauk, Long Island, and begin to understand what his hands were actually for. Fiona Kelly owned 42 acres of campground on the eastern edge of the South Fork. The kind of place that existed in deliberate contrast to the Hamptons infrastructure 12 miles west. No pool, no concierge, no Instagram filter that could make the outhouse charming. What it had was the Atlantic at the end of a short trail. A stand of pitch pine that smelled like every honest thing, and a cluster of cabins that were perpetually in need of repair by someone who knew what they were doing. Daniel had answered the ad she'd posted in a local hardware store, handwritten on an index card, the old-fashioned kind, which he later said was the thing that made him stop and read it. Handy person needed for cabin maintenance. Work exchange for site. Must be comfortable with actual work. He'd been sleeping in a motel in East Hampton for 3 weeks at that point, working short-term drafting contracts through a firm in Riverhead, and he had about 40% more pride than was useful to him and considerably less money. He showed up on a Tuesday morning in October, exactly 1 year, almost to the week, from when Margaret had held that first 401k statement at her kitchen table. And Fiona had handed him a list of things that needed doing on cabin 4 and a thermos of coffee and pointed him in the right direction. He had not expected her to be funny. She was 35 and matter-of-fact and appeared to own approximately 4 flannel shirts. And to have considered and rejected the premise that other people's opinions of her constituted useful information. She was from Maine originally, had bought the land with the insurance settlement after her mother's death, and ran the campground. The way someone runs something they actually love, not efficiently, necessarily, but honestly. She did not, he said later, treat him like someone who had failed. She treated him like someone who was in the middle of something. Margaret drove out on a Saturday in November, the year's 2nd November, when the pitch pines had gone. Copper and the ocean light was the particular silver of late autumn on the eastern end of the island. She had rented a car, a practical, white, mid-size sedan, that she drove with the careful competence of a woman who had spent 30 years navigating the city without one and had not forgotten the basic principles. She found cabin 4 by the sound of hammering. Daniel was on the small porch, replacing the deck boards one by one, pulling the old ones with a pry bar, fitting the new ones, countersinking the screws with the specific care of someone who is doing a thing correctly because it matters that it's done correctly and not for any other reason. His hands were different. She noticed that first the calluses, the particular roughness of skin that has been working rather than typing and shaking hands and scrolling. He was wearing a canvas jacket she did not recognize and had not shaved in several days. He looked up when he heard the car. For a moment, they both simply looked at each other across the small distance of the packed dirt path. Then he put the pry bar down and came down the porch steps, and she got out of the car, and they stood in the November light and the smell of pitch pine and ocean salt. And she opened her arms, and after a brief pause, that she understood completely, the pause of a man who is not yet sure he deserves this, he walked into them. She felt him exhale, the long kind, the kind you have been holding for a very long time. Fiona brought coffee in a thermos and set it on the porch railing. And then went back to whatever she'd been doing with the efficient tact of someone who understands when three is a crowd. Margaret liked her immediately and specifically, the way she liked people who took up exactly the space they needed and no more. They sat on the bench Daniel had built from reclaimed barnwood, solid, slightly uneven, the joinery done with care if not perfection. The kind of bench that would hold for 20 years and weather into something better than it started. Daniel held his coffee cup in both hands and looked at the trees. "I paid the attorney's fees," he said. "Webb said you covered the initial retainer but the settlement covered most of it, so." "I know," Margaret said. "He told me." A pause. The ocean was audible if you listened, a low, continuous sound, like something breathing. "The civil suit." He shook his head slightly. "Mom, I want to." "Daniel." She looked at him. "I know." He looked at her then, directly, and she saw in his face the full complexity of what a year of honest work had done. Not erased anything, but reorganized it, the way a room is reorganized after you've taken everything out and put back only what belongs. "I'm sorry for the Audi," he said. It was such a specific apology, so precisely the wrong scale for everything it stood in for that they both, simultaneously, laughed. The laugh came from somewhere unexpected, and it was real, and it moved through the November air between them and didn't disappear. "I'm sorry for the credit card," he said, when they'd settled. "Yes," she said. "I'm sorry for Claire's." He stopped. Started again. "I'm sorry for all of it, Mom. I don't have a better word than all of it." "I know," she said. "I believe you." She meant it. That was the thing about having done the grief properly, having sat with the photograph on the kitchen table and the overdue notices and the slow, painful accounting of what had gone wrong and why she had come out the other side of it without the specific bitterness that comes from unprocessed loss. She was angry at him, still, in the background way of a person who has been genuinely harmed. But underneath the anger was her son, and she had loved her son longer than she had been angry at him, and she intended to keep it that way. Fiona came back with more coffee without being asked. She refilled both cups and left the thermos on the railing. "She's good," Margaret said. "Yeah," Daniel said, and his voice had something in it she recognized as the early days of Robert. That slightly unguarded quality of a man who hasn't yet learned to be careful about what his voice reveals. She drove home in the early afternoon, taking the Sunrise Highway back through the flat, salt-grassed flats of the South Fork, through the small downtowns, with their boarded summer storefronts, through the gradual return of density as Long Island reasserted itself, until the city rose ahead of her. And she entered it by the bridge and followed the amber grid home. She parked the rental in the garage on 10th Street and walked the 4 blocks to her building in the November dusk, her coat buttoned, her breath visible in the cold. The copper smell of the city at evening mixing with something she recognized from Fiona's campground, or maybe she was imagining that, the way you carry good places with you for a while. In the apartment, the sage green hallway, the copper pots, the window above the sink. She hung her coat and filled the kettle and stood at the counter while the water heated, and she thought about what it meant to be 68 and to have spent a year being afraid and documented and legally protected and finally, simply, true. She thought about Daniel's hands on the pry bar. She thought about the bench that would weather into something better than it started. The kettle whistled. She poured the water. She carried the mug to the table and sat in her chair and looked at the kitchen that had held every important thing. "I thought starting over was something that happened to younger people," she thought. "I thought at my age the story was mostly written." She wrapped both hands around the mug and felt its warmth move into her palms. "But here I am, and here he is, and the bench is solid, and the coffee was good, and the ocean was breathing. At 68, I finally learned that starting over isn't failure. It's freedom." Friends, how did you find today's story? I've been sitting with it since the ending, and I have to tell you Margaret Evans has stayed with me in a particular way. Not because of the drama, though there was plenty of it. Not because of the gala, or the live stream, or the moment the card was declined in front of 500,000 strangers. Those were the spectacular moments. But what I keep returning to is that quiet Saturday morning when Margaret sat at her kitchen table with a cup of tea, going cold, and a stack of documents she hadn't asked for, and a photograph of her son in a garage holding a hammer, and she chose, in that moment, to think. To remember. To believe in the version of him that was real before the version of him that went wrong. That's not a small thing. That is, I think, the hardest thing. This story is about money, yes. About identity theft and forged signatures and a power of attorney form tucked into a designer handbag. But underneath all of it, it's a story about what we owe each other in families. About how love can be weaponized against the very people who offer it most freely. And about how the decision to protect yourself, truly protect yourself, legally and financially and emotionally, is not a betrayal of love. It is the fullest expression of it. Because Margaret's actions didn't destroy her relationship with Daniel. They gave him back the only version of himself worth keeping. We all face moments where we have to choose who we are. Where the comfortable story, the one where we pretend everything is fine, where we absorb the harm. Rather than confront it, becomes more expensive than we can afford. Margaret's lesson is that dignity is not something others can take from you unless you stop reaching for it. And it is never too late to reach. I hope this story brought you something today, a little comfort, a little fire. A little of that particular peace that comes from watching the truth finally find its way into the light. I hope it reminded you that starting over, at any age, is not failure. It is freedom. And if it did any of those things for you, please subscribe and hit that like button. It helps more than you know, and it tells me you want more stories like this one. I'll be here. Take good care of yourselves. See you next time.